Most people imagine a Great Depression happening the way it did in 1929, slowly, gradually, with enough warning signs that anyone paying attention could prepare. They picture breadlines forming over months, stock prices sliding over weeks, banks failing one at a time, while worried depositors whisper in the streets. A sepia-toned catastrophe that gave people time to react, to adjust, to survive. But here is what almost nobody wants to admit. A modern Great Depression would not unfold like that at all. It would happen faster than your morning commute, more brutal than anything the 1930s generation experienced, and it would catch most people so off guard that by the time they understood what was happening, the damage would already be done. This is not about fear-mongering or predicting some inevitable collapse. It is about understanding something important that most economists, politicians, and financial planners rarely say out loud. The very systems we built to protect ourselves have made us more fragile, not less. The speed that powers our prosperity is the same speed that could dismantle it overnight. And the safety nets we count on might be the first things to fail when we need them most. To understand why a modern depression would hit harder and faster than the 1930s, we need to start with the most fundamental difference between then and now: speed. In 1929, when the stock market crashed, news of the collapse traveled by telegraph and morning newspaper. Brokers received updates hours after trades occurred. Investors made decisions based on yesterday's prices, not yesterday's milliseconds. The crash itself unfolded over multiple days, with Black Thursday on October 24th, followed by Black Monday and Black Tuesday the following week. People had time to process what was happening. Banks didn't fail all at once. Panic spread city by city, sometimes state by state. The Great Depression was not a single event, but a rolling disaster that gave communities at least some opportunity to adapt. Families moved in together, neighbors shared resources. People found ways to survive because the collapse came in waves they could see forming. Today, that timeline has compressed into something unrecognizable. On May 6, 2010, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged nearly 1,000 points in less than 10 minutes. $1 trillion in market value vanished and partially recovered before most Americans knew anything had happened. They called it the flash crash. It was caused by a combination of algorithmic trading programs that spiraled out of control in a feedback loop no human could have stopped in time. Now, imagine that, but sustained. Imagine it happening across every asset class simultaneously. Imagine it triggering a chain reaction through a financial system so interconnected that failure in one corner of the market instantly contaminates every other. This is not hypothetical. The infrastructure exists for exactly this kind of collapse to happen. Algorithmic trading now accounts for the majority of stock market volume. Trades are executed in microseconds, faster than a human can blink. News spreads globally within minutes. Bank transfers that once took days now take seconds. In 1929, if a major bank failed in New York, it could take days for that panic to reach California. Today, a bank failure in San Francisco reaches Tokyo before the first news article is even written. The speed that makes our modern economy so efficient is the same speed that could make its collapse instantaneous. But speed is only part of the story. The more dangerous difference is what happens when collapse meets leverage. When historians examine the Great Depression, they often point to margin buying as a key accelerant. Investors in the 1920s could purchase stocks with just 10% down, borrowing the rest. When prices fell, those debts became unpayable. Forced selling created more falling prices, which triggered more forced selling. It was a vicious cycle. But compared to today's debt levels, the 1920s look almost quaint. The United States national debt in 1929 was roughly $17 billion. Today, it exceeds $34 trillion. That is not a typo. Trillion with a T. Household debt in America now surpasses $17 trillion. Corporate debt is at record highs, with many companies borrowing heavily during the era of near-zero interest rates. Credit card debt recently crossed $1 trillion for the first time in history. And then there are derivatives, the financial instruments that Warren Buffett once called weapons of mass destruction. The notional value of the global derivatives market is estimated to exceed $600 trillion. That is roughly 6 times the entire world's annual economic output. These are not assets. They are bets. Complex financial contracts layered on top of other contracts, wrapped around bonds, mortgages, commodities, and currencies. In 2008, derivatives played a central role in amplifying the subprime mortgage crisis into a global financial meltdown. Lehman Brothers collapsed not just because of bad mortgages, but because of the web of interconnected obligations that nobody fully understood until it was too late. Now, imagine a depression hitting this system. Debt amplifies everything. In good times, leverage makes you wealthier faster. In bad times, it makes you poorer faster. When asset prices fall, debts remain. When incomes disappear, monthly payments do not. The mountain of debt we are standing on today means that any significant economic downturn would trigger cascading defaults on a scale the 1930s never experienced. In the Great Depression, banks failed because depositors withdrew their savings. In a modern depression, banks might fail because the complex web of obligations tying them together suddenly becomes impossible to untangle. And that is assuming the basic systems we rely on even continue to function. There is something that most people never think about when they imagine economic collapse: the physical reality of how modern life actually works. Walk into any grocery store in America and you will find fully stocked shelves. Fruits from Chile, vegetables from Mexico, products manufactured in China, packaged in Vietnam, shipped through ports in Long Beach. It all arrives exactly when it needs to, in exactly the right quantities. This is called just-in-time inventory management. It is a triumph of modern logistics. It is also terrifyingly fragile. Most grocery stores carry 3 to 4 days of inventory on their shelves. That is all. The food you see is not stored in massive warehouses waiting to be distributed. It is in constant motion, arriving on trucks that are already scheduled for their next delivery. Gas stations operate the same way. Pharmacies too. The entire supply chain that feeds, fuels, and medicates 330 million Americans runs with almost no buffer. In March 2020, we got a preview of what happens when that system hiccups. Within 72 hours of widespread panic over COVID-19, store shelves across the country were stripped bare. Toilet paper, cleaning supplies, canned goods, bottled water, all gone. Not because there was an actual shortage, but because the system has zero margin for sudden changes in demand. Now, imagine that lasting months instead of days. Imagine it happening during actual supply disruption, not just panic buying. Imagine it during a financial crisis that also affects shipping companies, trucking fleets, and the payment systems that keep commerce flowing. In the 1930s, roughly 25% of Americans lived on farms. They grew food. They raised animals. They had wells and knew how to preserve meat without refrigeration. Local economies existed that could sustain communities even when the broader national economy collapsed. The Great Depression was devastating, but it hit a population that still remembered how to survive without modern conveniences. Today, less than 2% of Americans work in agriculture. Most people live in cities or suburbs entirely dependent on supply chains they never see. The average person cannot grow food, purify water, generate power, or repair the basic systems their life depends on. They do not even own the tools to try. This is not a criticism. It is a description of reality. Modern life traded self-sufficiency for specialization and efficiency. That trade has made us incomprehensibly wealthy by historical standards. But it has also made us incomprehensibly dependent on systems that most people never consider until they stop working. The generation that survived the Great Depression had skills and knowledge passed down from generations that knew genuine hardship. They knew how to stretch meals, mend clothes, and make do with nothing. They had extended families and tight communities that pooled resources during the worst years. We have Amazon Prime and Instacart. But what about the banks? Surely the financial system learned from the 1930s. We have deposit insurance now. We have federal regulators. We have too big to fail institutions that the government would never let collapse. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank became the second largest bank failure in American history. It collapsed in 36 hours, not weeks, not months, less than 2 days. Here is what happened. The bank had invested heavily in long-term government bonds during the era of low interest rates. When rates rose, those bonds lost value on paper. Depositors, many of them technology companies with far more than the FDIC-insured limit in their accounts, got nervous. They started withdrawing money. Word spread on social media. Within hours, a full-scale bank run was underway. By the time regulators intervened, the bank was gone. $40 billion withdrawn in a single day. The fastest bank run in history. In the 1930s, bank runs required panicked depositors to physically line up outside branches, waiting for tellers to hand them their money. The process took time. Other depositors in other cities might not even know a run was happening until it was already too late. The chaos spread, but slowly enough that some banks could close their doors, call for emergency reserves, or receive government intervention. Today, you can transfer your entire life savings to another institution while sitting on your couch in your pajamas. It takes seconds. No lines, no waiting, no friction. The same technology that makes banking convenient has made bank runs instantaneous. And here is the part that most people find genuinely unsettling. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the agency that guarantees your bank deposits, has approximately $116 billion in its fund. The total amount of deposits in American banks exceeds $17 trillion. That is less than 1% coverage. The FDIC works because bank failures are supposed to be rare, isolated events. The fund can handle one bank collapsing, maybe even several, but it cannot handle a system-wide crisis where multiple major institutions fail simultaneously. In that scenario, the only backstop is the federal government printing money to cover the shortfall, which creates its own devastating consequences. The 9,000 bank failures of the Great Depression happened over years. A modern banking crisis could happen over a weekend, but this is where people usually interrupt with a reassuring thought. That was the 1930s. We have safety nets now. Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, food stamps. The government would step in and prevent the worst suffering. This belief is understandable. These programs have formed the foundation of American economic security for nearly a century. They were created specifically in response to the Great Depression to ensure that kind of suffering would never happen again. But there is a problem with this assumption. And it is a big one. These programs do not work the way most people think they do. They are not savings accounts. They are not funds sitting in a vault waiting to be distributed. They are transfer programs that depend on current tax revenue flowing in to pay current benefits flowing out. Social Security works because the workers paying taxes today fund the retirees collecting checks today. Medicare works the same way. When the economy is growing and employment is high, these systems function smoothly. Revenue comes in, checks go out. Everyone is happy. But what happens when unemployment spikes to 25%, like it did during the Great Depression? Tax revenue collapses. Fewer people earning money means fewer people paying into the system. Meanwhile, demand for benefits skyrockets. More people need unemployment insurance. More people need food assistance. More people apply for disability or early retirement because there are no jobs. The math stops working almost immediately. Social Security's trust fund is already projected to be depleted by 2033, and that estimate assumes no economic catastrophe between now and then. Medicare's hospital insurance fund faces similar problems. These programs were designed for demographics and economic conditions that no longer exist. They are already struggling in good times. During the Great Depression, these programs did not exist. That seems like it made things worse, and in many ways it did. The suffering was extreme precisely because there was no systematic support. But there is a dangerous flip side to having safety nets. People depend on them. Millions of Americans have structured their entire financial lives around the assumption that these programs will be there when needed. They have not saved for retirement because Social Security exists. They have not planned for health care because Medicare will cover them. In the 1930s, people expected nothing from the government and received nothing. It was brutal, but they were psychologically prepared for self-reliance. Today, tens of millions of people expect government support that might become mathematically impossible to provide. What happens when those checks stop coming is not something anyone wants to think about too carefully. There is another layer to this that rarely gets discussed. The world economy of 1929 was international, but nothing like today's level of integration. In the 1930s, most countries had largely self-contained economies. Trade happened, but supply chains were shorter. simpler, and often redundant. If one country's economy collapsed, the impact on others was real but limited. Britain could survive an American depression. Japan could function independently. Economies were connected but not entangled. Today, everything is different. The smartphone in your pocket contains components manufactured in over 30 countries. Rare earth minerals from China, processors from Taiwan, glass from Japan, assembled in Vietnam, designed in California. A single consumer product is the result of a global supply chain so complex that no one person fully understands it. This integration has made us wealthy beyond any generation's imagination. It has also made us vulnerable in ways previous generations never were. Consider what happens if a major financial crisis hits the United States. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency. Roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. International trade, from oil to semiconductors, is largely denominated in dollars. When America sneezes, the world catches pneumonia. A serious American depression would not stay contained within American borders for even a moment. It would freeze international trade. It would devastate emerging markets that depend on dollar-denominated debt. It would send shockwaves through every economy connected to the global system, which means every economy on Earth. But the reverse is also true. A crisis originating elsewhere could cascade into the United States before policymakers even understood what was happening. A banking crisis in Europe, a currency collapse in Asia, a debt default in emerging markets. The contagion pathways are everywhere. In 1929, economic dominoes fell slowly enough that nations could observe, prepare, and attempt response. In a modern crisis, those dominoes would fall simultaneously. There would be no time for observation or response. The interconnection that drives global prosperity is the same interconnection that would amplify global collapse. And this brings us to perhaps the most overlooked difference between then and now. What happens to money itself during a depression? The Great Depression is remembered as a time of falling prices. Deflation. Goods became cheaper because nobody had money to buy them. Wages fell because employers had no revenue. The problem was not that money became worthless, but that money became too scarce. People who held cash actually gained purchasing power as prices collapsed around them. This made the suffering intense, but it followed a certain logic. If you had a job, even a low-paying one, you could actually survive because everything cost less. If you owned property outright, you could hold onto it because there was no inflation eroding your position. The wealthy hoarded cash, and that cash maintained its value. A modern depression would almost certainly not work that way. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, the Federal Reserve responded with something unprecedented. They created money. Trillions of dollars injected into the financial system through quantitative easing, bailouts, and emergency lending programs. The goal was to prevent deflation, to keep credit flowing, to avoid the liquidity trap that paralyzed the 1930s economy. It worked, sort of. The financial system did not collapse, but the playbook was established. When crisis hits, central banks print money. This means a modern depression would likely feature something the 1930s mostly avoided: inflation. Imagine unemployment spiking while prices also rise. Your income disappears, but rent does not fall. Food becomes more expensive, not less. Savings lose purchasing power even as you desperately need them. This nightmare scenario has a name: stagflation. It happened in the 1970s, though on a scale far smaller than a true depression would bring. The Federal Reserve today faces an impossible choice. Let a crisis run its course, which would mean deflation, mass bankruptcy, and suffering like the 1930s. Or print money to prevent the worst outcomes, which risks turning a depression into an inflationary crisis that destroys savings and purchasing power in a different way. Either path leads to pain, but the money printing path is politically easier, which means it is the path that would likely be taken. And that means a modern depression would not just feature mass unemployment, it would feature mass unemployment combined with rising prices. The combination that economists consider the most economically devastating scenario imaginable. Your savings would evaporate, fixed incomes would become worthless, and unlike deflation, where waiting brings lower prices, Inflation punishes everyone who is not moving money into real assets immediately. The average person would be squeezed from every direction. So, where does this leave us? It would be easy to conclude from all this that collapse is inevitable, that we are doomed, that there is no point in planning or preparing because the forces arrayed against us are too powerful. But that is not the point of understanding these dynamics. The generation that lived through the Great Depression did not have access to this analysis. They did not know what was coming. They could not prepare for what they did not understand. And yet they survived. Many of them even thrived in the decades that followed. The Depression became a crucible that forged resilience, community, and practical wisdom that lasted generations. The point is not to predict collapse. No one can do that with certainty, and anyone who claims otherwise is selling something. The point is to understand vulnerability, to see clearly what most people prefer to leave unexamined. The modern economy is a marvel. It has lifted billions out of poverty, connected the world in unprecedented ways, and created abundance that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. But that abundance rests on systems that are far more fragile than they appear. Speed creates efficiency and vulnerability. Integration creates prosperity and contagion risk. Safety nets create security and dependence. None of this means collapse is imminent. It means that if collapse comes, it would arrive faster and hit harder than anything in living memory. The same forces that make our economy powerful make it potentially unstable in ways the 1930s economy was not. The people who survived the Great Depression did so not because they saw it coming, but because they had skills, communities, and psychological resilience that modern life has quietly eroded. They knew how to do without because doing without had been part of life for generations before them. Most people today have never experienced genuine scarcity. They have never grown their own food or lived without electricity or gone weeks without income. They have never tested themselves against real economic hardship. That does not mean they cannot develop those capabilities. It means they have not had to yet. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from comparing these two eras is not about prediction, but about preparation. Not preparing for some specific doomsday scenario, but preparing for uncertainty itself. Understanding that systems fail. That comfort is not guaranteed. That the speed and integration that power modern life can reverse just as quickly as they advanced. The question is not whether a modern Great Depression could happen. History shows that economic catastrophes are a recurring feature of human civilization, not a one-time aberration. The question is whether we would handle it as well as the generation that came before, whether we have the skills, the community, and the psychological grounding to endure something that severe. That is the question almost nobody is asking. And it might be the only question that truly matters. Because when the next crisis comes, however, and whenever it arrives, the speed of the modern world will not slow down to give anyone time to prepare. The complexity of our systems will not simplify itself for convenience. The debts we have accumulated will not disappear because they have become inconvenient. Whatever happens next will happen fast. And it will reveal whether the extraordinary prosperity of the modern age made us stronger or simply made us forget what strength actually requires.